Nick kind of already introduced himself, but in case you are new, my name is Elise Bernstein. I am a soon-to-be graduate of the University of Minnesota. I am getting a degree in environmental science, policy, and management with a focus in environmental education and communication. So I have a lot of experience participating in events like this. I work as a communications assistant for NCO Magazine and as an environmental educator for the University of Minnesota Bee Squad. So this is where a lot of my knowledge on gardening, planting native, and pollinators comes from.
And I'm Nick Velkoff. I'm the co-founder of the studio and with Auburndale Builders.
So to review, here's our schedule. We've already had sessions 1 and 2, and the recordings of those are available on the studio's website if you want to go back and revisit those. So today we're on our 3rd session, and then we'll have one more in just under a month. So as far as the agenda for today, we're going to start with some review from our first 2 sessions in case you missed them. So I'll talk a little bit about what is biodiversity and why is it important. We also talked about spring practices and the harms associated with the lawn in our last session. So I'll review some of that really briefly, and then we will dive into some essential summer practices and how to plan for fall.
And Elise, I'm just going to turn off my camera, but I just mentioned if people want to post questions in the chat box, we'll take questions at the end and Elise will respond to them.
Perfect. Sounds good. Okay, so to get started with that review real quick, if you've been to previous sessions, I'm sure you've already heard this, but I'll just go through it really quickly. So biodiversity is defined as the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. So this quantifies all of the living things on Earth. So this is all the plants, animals, fungi, and humans as well. And that's why I bring attention to this definition, is because it includes humans. And there are estimates from National Geographic of there being about 9 million species on planet Earth right now. But there are some scientists that argue that this number is as high as 100 million. But ultimately, we don't really know. There's a lot of species out there. So why should we care about biodiversity? Without biodiversity, there's nothing to support life on Earth. And unfortunately, biodiversity is rapidly decreasing. So it's important because it supports our food supply. 1 in every 3 bites of food was created by a pollinator, and biodiversity can help to improve soil quality and improve farming sustainability to make our food supply more reliable. Biodiversity also conserves and protects local watersheds. So organisms that live within our water can break down excess nutrients, pollutants, and pathogens to give us cleaner, healthier water, not just for humans, but for also for other organisms that live in aquatic spaces. Biodiversity also breaks down pollutants in our atmosphere and environment. So trees and soil are 2 examples of this. They both sequester carbon from the atmosphere, so they're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, which helps to reduce the impacts of climate change. And then additionally, biodiversity can also improve human well-being. So by that, I specifically mean like spending time in nature. So humans who spend more time in nature experience less feelings of depression and anxiety. Children who have more recreational time outdoors have fewer behavioral problems, and access to a green space at your workplace can actually result in higher productivity. So we are still centering all of our content around this idea of cues to care. So this is another piece of review, but essentially cues to care sums up the idea of showing your neighbors that your landscaping choices are intentional and meant to benefit the broader ecological community. So in the past, we talked a little bit about stylized rewilding. We talked a little bit about planting a bee lawn, which we'll get into a little bit more today. And then we've talked about, and we'll continue to talk about, some other sort of unconventional landscaping approaches that your neighbors might not think are the most aesthetically pleasing. But this is where cues to care comes in, where you might want to include signs or borders or intentional architectural features that are a way to show off your cues to care. So essentially a way to tell your neighbors that you made this choice on purpose to cater to biodiversity in your area. So again, in case you missed our last session, I'm going to jump really quickly through just some of the key points in the history of the lawn, since there's a lot of information associated there. But the first lawns originated in Europe, and they were deliberately cultivated for the wealthy, because these lawns needed a lot of maintenance that had to be done by hand to keep them short, since the original lawns originated before we had lawnmowers. Then once we did have lawnmowers, lawn care became a little bit easier, but lawnmowers were still not affordable, so most people still weren't able to have lawns. So shortly after lawns originated in Europe, they made their way into the United States, and lawns slowly started to become a staple in suburban communities, along with the expectation of lawn beautification for the sake of people passing by your home. So now we expect to see lawns in most of our yards. They've become the dominant aesthetic desire in suburban communities and beyond, but lawns do not cater to biodiversity. They really are seen as a status symbol, and they are harmful to the native plants and animals that live in your communities. Most lawn grasses are not native to the US and take away space from native plants that serve as food and habitat for pollinators or other animals. And furthermore, lawn care practices are also really harmful to the environment. So lawnmowers are inefficient in their fuel burning. 1 hour of mowing produces the same amount of pollution as driving a car for 350 miles. Keeping your lawn green also requires a lot of water, and this is especially a concern in drought-prone areas. Fossil fuel derived fertilizers are intended to keep your grass looking really nice, but they can run off into local bodies of water, which can harm aquatic animal species and us as humans as well. And then pesticides, which are conventionally used in lawns to remove pests, can actually be really harmful to native bees and other insects, and can damage human health as well. So some of the spring practices we talked about last time is no-mow May, as we call it here in Minnesota, or no-mow early spring, which is kind of what makes a little bit more sense out in Massachusetts. But this is really the time of year when pollinators begin to emerge from either their winter hibernation or they're hatching out of their eggs for the first time. And when their first sources of food start to bloom. So mowing too early can harm these insects and the food that they need to survive. We also talked a little bit about building bee homes, which are homes for solitary bees made of either stick bundles or wooden blocks. But I want to reiterate that it is important to remember that you should never use bamboo for a bee house. If you Google like bee houses for sale, or if you're looking for one online, most of the ones that you will find are made of bamboo. But this is problematic for a lot of species of bees, specifically mason bees. So you want to avoid using bamboo in a bee house if you can. So another big point we made in the essential practices for spring is planting native plants. So these should be implemented into your landscape in early spring. You want to select a variety of plants that bloom during all points of the year. So this includes some that bloom in the spring, some that bloom in the summer, and some that bloom in the fall. So a few of the plants that I recommended for the New England area are wild geranium, swamp milkweed, and the calico aster. And these are just a few of all of the native plants that are good options for the New England area. There's a full list of native plants of the Northeast in our resources document, which is on the studio's website. We also touched briefly on using compost in your gardens. You might choose to add 1 to 2 inches of compost in your garden beds. And this should be put into your garden about 1 to 2 weeks before planting, and it can help to improve the quality of your soil. You also want to avoid using pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, fertilizers, etc., because these synthetic chemicals are really harmful to wildlife. Pesticides can kill important pollinating insects, and fertilizers can be dangerous to human health and even the health of our pets. We also talked a lot about rewilding, or the idea of stylized rewilding, which is the idea of letting nature take care of itself. But by following this practice, you're pretty much just picking an area of your yard and kind of letting it do its thing. So in following cues to care, you might want to move your grass in a way that it creates something that's more eye-catching to make it look a little bit more interesting than just grass, or maybe you want to include some sort of sign or border to show that you are rewilding an area to care for biodiversity. So now that we've touched on some of the stuff that we looked into in our first two sessions, let's move into some ecological concepts and important practices to think about for summertime. So to start, I wanted to introduce the concept of a food web, which is an important ecological concept that illustrates the feeding relationships within a community. So it's broken up at different levels, starting with plants as primary producers, and then moving up to different level of consumers. So in the image on the left, we've got the plants at the bottom, moving up to grasshoppers and squirrels, moving up to scorpions, and moving up to foxes and eagles that are the tertiary consumers. So energy is transferred between the different species as you move through the food web. And this also represents the different interactions that these species might be having. So I'm placing an emphasis on food webs today because of the primary producers, which are plants. So increasing the number of native plants in your yard can increase the amount of viable energy for different animal species that are within the food web or ecological community within your area. So planting native obviously not only helps the bees, but other animals that might be frequenting your landscape. So one of the reasons I bring up food webs is because of the rabbits. So the image on the right is a picture from my parents' garden, and it shows the crazy rabbit problem we had in the summer of 2020. The rabbits ate so much of the hosta, it looked like somebody had taken a machete to it. And pretty much anytime a new flowering plant was blooming, the rabbits were coming and eating those flowers right as they were coming out. So rabbits have problems associated with them, which I'll talk about in a second, but we also forget that rabbits are still part of the ecosystem. Our neighborhoods and our built environments are mostly made up of humans. You know, that's who we're interacting with on a daily basis. But the bunnies, squirrels, bees, other plants and animals that are in your community they were here first. They're still part of the local ecological community. And rabbits actually eat some of the weedy plants that might disrupt either the aesthetic you're looking for in your garden, or maybe competing with other plant species that you have planted. And they're also lower on the trophic level in that food web, so they might be an important source of food for any larger predators that you have in your neighborhood. There are usually a few sightings of coyotes in my neighborhood every year, so the rabbits are likely serving as sources of food for those coyotes. But one point in planting native is to make sure that you are giving the bees enough food. So when the rabbits are destroying the plants that are intended for the bees, that point is kind of eliminated. So this is where we talk about kind of finding balance with the rabbits. And one way to do that is by rewilding areas of your yard, because this could be a great space for rabbits to kind of eat the weeds or plants that are growing in the rewilded areas. And rewilded areas can also be suitable nesting habitats for rabbits because they like really tall grass when they have babies. There are some natural alternatives to rabbit repellents also, if you worry that the rabbits are taking too much food away from the bees. So some things that you can do is put spices in your garden, like cayenne pepper, something that is spicy that will deter the rabbits from eating that plant. And then another thing you can do is include either human or pet hair in your garden. I know this sounds a little bit weird, but I think it's the smell of either the humans or your pets that will deter rabbits from frequenting your garden. All right, so also in the summertime, I wanted to touch on the idea of planting native again and avoiding eye-catching alien ornamentals at the plant nurseries. So as we talked about in our last session, the best time to plant is in the spring. But you can do some work to add more plants to your garden beds during the summer. You just have to be a little bit more careful about it. So to safely plant during the summer, the best time of day is early in the morning to avoid peak heat and sunlight. So once you're doing that, if you're planting early in the morning, you still want to make sure that you're watering these plants really thoroughly, and you're probably covering them with 2 to 3 inches of mulch, because this will help the plants retain that moisture and give them a better chance of survival since they're being planted in the summer where temperatures are already really hotter. So if you're looking for new plants to put into your garden beds in the summer, I made a list of some common non-native species that you might want to avoid just because they're not necessarily going to cater to local biodiversity as well as something native. So some of these species are daylilies, which are from Asia, Russian sage, which is a little bit more complicated than a lot of other non-native species because it is a bee favorite. I know that the honeybees love the Russian sage we have planted in our yard, and the bee lab that I work at, we recommend Russian sage as well, but it is a little bit more complicated because it is not a native species. So there are other native alternatives that also might better suit the bees and other animals that are visiting your landscape. Tulips are another non-native species, boxwood shrubs, hydrangeas, magnolia trees, which are native to the southeastern United States, and then lilac bushes. So what exactly is the difference between non-native and invasive? So we talked a bit about invasive species in the context of Norway maples in our first 2 sessions, but invasive and non-native are actually not the same thing. So invasive species are non-native species that cause harm to the environment, economy, or the health of humans, plants, or the planet. So some of these species are trees like the Norway maple, Bradford pear, like we talked about, buckthorn, like we talked about, and then there's also animal species that can be invasive, like zebra mussels, for example. And they cause harm to the whole ecological community because they're outcompeting the native species, and they don't provide adequate food for the animals that need food. Non-native species, however, are organisms that do not naturally occur in an area, but have been introduced deliberately by human activity. But they don't necessarily hinder or prevent the survival of other species in the ecosystem. So the species that I talked about in the previous slide are non-native species, but they don't necessarily cause harm to the entire ecological community. But they may have some problems because they might be taking up space for other native species that would be a better source of food to pollinators or other animals. So during the summer, another thing you want to do is think about removing any baby invasive species that you're seeing. So one of the key points that I've highlighted across all of these sessions is making sure you're making regular observations in your yard, whether you're uploading those to iNaturalist or you're keeping a regular nature journal, but spending a lot of time getting to know your landscape. And one of the reasons this is important is so it will be easier to see when these invasive species are popping up. If you're spending more time outside, it might be easier for you to spot something that wasn't there the day before, and then you can take a look at it and say, oh, is this something I planted, or is this something that could cause an issue in the future? And catching these invasive species like Norway maples while they're young makes the removal process a lot easier. I mean, it's a lot easier to remove something that looks like a little maple sprout than something that is a really huge tree. So I also want to talk about some things beyond just the concept of planting for the summertime, like the idea of installing rain barrels or using grow bags for vegetables. We've talked a little bit about electrifying the landscape before, but we'll touch on it again today. We're going to talk a little bit about birds, how to build a bee bath, implementing a brush pile, and more habitat space like toad houses. So to start, let's talk about rain barrels. So unfortunately, one of the repercussions of climate change is increased, intense, and frequent drought. So using a rainwater collection system like these rain barrels can help to mitigate the stress that is already placed on our water systems during the summer. It can also take some of the stress off of you. It will save you some money to reuse rainwater in watering your yard or your plants in your yard. And rainwater can be really beneficial for plants also. So the water that's coming from the taps in our houses has been treated to be considered potable water, since that's necessary for human health. We can't necessarily drink any water from any source and be okay. That water will make us sick. But the chemicals that are used to treat water to make it potable for us as humans aren't necessary for plants, and they can actually be harmful for plants if the concentrations of certain chemicals are too high. So in talking about this, I also want to add that potable water systems cannot be connected in any way to rainwater systems. So they must be situated, rainwater systems must be situated away from any taps that are coming from your home. And rain barrels are really easy to set up at home. They can be placed to catch the water that runs off of your roof during a storm. And most rain barrels hold about 50 to 55 gallons of water. And in my research, I found that most gardens typically require about 5 gallons of water per every 8 square feet. So one rain barrel should hold enough water for you to water your garden a couple times. And then if it's possible, you might want to place your rain barrel at a little bit of a higher elevation to improve the water pressure when you are watering. So rain barrels are just one of many ways to conserve water in your landscape. So another thing you might want to think about is planting some drought-resistant plants. UMass has a list of drought-resistant plants for the Northeast that I have linked in our resources document, but not all of the plants on that list are necessarily native. So if you're thinking about planting some drought-resistant plants, it might be a good idea to compare the native plants of the Northeast list to the one with drought-resistant plants. And I think the native plants of the Northeast list also has something about water requirements on it. So with that, I touched on the idea of xeriscaping in our last session, but I want to talk a little bit more about it today. But essentially the idea of xeriscaping is designing your landscape to require minimal water. So these are most common in desert climates, but climate change is continuing to throw us in unexpected directions. So being prepared for that drought that might be coming in can be beneficial to the plants in your landscape and also your wallet, since you might be saving some money on water. So in xeriscaping practices, you want to choose drought-resistant plants again, and then you want to replace grassy areas with soils or rocks or mulch, because these are things that are going to hold in that moisture for a lot longer than just grass. So using large stones in your garden not only reduces the frequency of watering, but it can also create little microclimates or that serve as habitats for insects, because insects can find their way into those spaces and either use those as nests or small habitats. So xeriscaping is another great alternative to the lawn. All right, so we also have the idea of grow bags, and grow bags are great for growing vegetables. So I wanted to talk about growing vegetables at home today, also because of its link to climate change. So typically when you go to the grocery store and you pick up some fruits or vegetables, your favorite fruits and vegetables, they were likely grown, especially here in Minnesota, they were likely grown either across the country, somewhere like California, or even in a different part of the world. And many of your favorite fruits and vegetables might have been grown with pesticides or some sort of fertilizer that was harmful to biodiversity or your health. And growing vegetables at home can kind of eliminate this because you know exactly what is going into them. Furthermore, when those fruits and vegetables are grown in a different part of the world, they have to be shipped or transported to you, likely either on a truck, on a plane, or on a ship. And those different forms of transportation are using fossil fuels. So that is another thing that's contributing to climate change, to move the fruits and vegetables across the country, when during the summertime you have the option to grow them at home for yourself. So grow bags are super easy to use. They're round containers that are made of fabric that are really lightweight, so they're much easier to move than say a terracotta pot or some sort of large planter. They also drain really well, making it really hard to overwater your plants. And then tomatoes, cucumbers, salad greens, and some herbs are just a list of a few plants that can do really well in grow bags. All right, so we've talked a little bit about this before, but the idea of electrifying your lawn care equipment. So I've reiterated many times that the best way to care for biodiversity is to avoid mowing as much as possible. But using an electric lawnmower or other electric lawn care equipment can help reduce stress on local biodiversity if you have to mow. It's not contributing to carbon emissions as much as a conventional lawnmower does, and it creates less noise pollution. And the idea of lawn care equipment is super attractive to some people because the batteries that you use for your lawnmower can also be used for your chainsaw or for your weed whacker and even for your snowblower in the wintertime. So with this, something else you might want to do is research local environmentally conscious landscapers. So you might want to look for some landscapers that maybe plant or work with biodiversity in mind. And maybe some of these gardeners and landscapers are using electric tools like you're interested in doing. I found a list of some environmentally conscious landscapers from Green Newton, which is in the list of resources. And these are 3 companies that were included in that list. So we haven't really talked much about birds yet, but they are also a part of our of local biodiversity, and they also serve as pollinators. So the 2 easiest ways to create space for birds in your landscape are to build bird baths and bird houses. So bird baths are pretty easy to create using old terracotta pots, and you can really personalize them to your liking or to fit your landscaping, and you can even get your kids involved in the process. So one thing you can do is take an old terracotta pot and flip it upside down, or 2 old terracotta pots and flip them upside down and stack one on top of the other, and then set the base dish on top of that. And then you can either paint them or personalize them however you like. And then really all you have to do is fill it with water to allow for birds to come. So that's pretty much, in my opinion, the easiest sort of DIY bird bath. There's a lot of other methods available online. And another thing you might want to do for birds is create bird houses. So Nest Watch is a really great resource by Cornell University that can help you determine the right kind of birdhouse for the native birds in your area. So I went on to the Nest Watch site and it asks you what region you're living in. So I put in, because I'm here in Minnesota, I put in Great Lakes region, and then it asks you the type of area you live in. So I put in town. There were options asking about like more rural areas. So I put in town because that was what was most fitting. And then it came up with a list of native species that are in my area. So like the American robin was one of them. And it says on some of those too, like if those species are in decline, which I thought was interesting because a lot of bird populations are in decline. So you might want to pick a species that's in decline and create a habitat for that. But once you pick the bird you'd like to focus on, you can click on download construction plan, which will give you information on the difficulty of creating the birdhouse, the materials you might need, and where it should be placed in relation to your home and the rest of your landscape. And like I said, many bird species are in decline across the US, so providing them with safe and secure housing can help alleviate some of the stress of the habitat loss that's going on for a lot of birds right now. So we talked about bird baths, but what about bee baths? So bees need water too. Pollinators, as I've said a million times, are super important, and creating a bee bath can provide them with necessary water. Honeybees specifically will use this water to dilute their honey, aid in their digestion, keep their hive cool, and feed their babies. So there's a lot of things that bees are using water for. So these bee baths can be built similar to bird baths, where you use an upside down pot with a dish on top. Glass or ceramic are usually ideal, but not necessary for a bee bath. The difference between bee baths and bird baths, though, is the amount of water that you're putting into them. So in a bee bath, you want to have some flat like river stones that get placed in the dish, and then add a small amount of water, but not enough to submerge the stones. So basically the bees can fly in, land on the rocks, and then drink some of the water out of the bee bath. And these bee baths do want to be cleaned daily and replaced with fresh water. And this is to avoid the spread of any pathogens between different species of bees or between different bees. And with making your regular observations, you might want to take a look at where most bees are frequenting your garden and put the bee bath somewhere close, so they might be more likely to visit it. All right, so another super unconventional approach to caring for biodiversity in your yard is building a brush pile. And this might sound crazy to a lot of people because it's essentially creating a large pile of sticks in your backyard, but it's actually great for local wildlife, including woodpeckers, owls, and insects. Brush piles can create essential nesting habitats and overwintering spaces for these species. So they're usually made up of large logs from a dead tree. And typically dead trees are removed from our modern landscape due to aesthetic or safety concerns, but they really do pose minimal risk. So if you have a dead tree in your yard, you can leave it standing because it will become a great hotspot for local biodiversity. And building a brush pile is a pretty large project that does require some of that attention to cues to care, depending on where you're putting it. If it's in view of your neighbors, you might want to add some sort of border or signage to show them exactly what you're doing. You can potentially acquire dead trees from a local park or from neighbors that you are noticing are cutting down dead trees that would otherwise just get disposed of. Hardwood logs with the bark still attached are the best choice for this kind of project. And when you have your large log, you want to bury one end just a few inches into the soil to help it retain some moisture. Then you want to have the log, some larger branches and stones be placed at the bottom of the pile to create stability. And then you can layer other materials crosswise across that base pile with at least 6 inches of space in between where the sticks are overlapping to allow access by birds and small mammals. Insects will be able to get into the pile pretty much anywhere because they don't need much space, but those larger mammals might need a little bit more space to get in. And the Xerces Society has a really great resource on building brush piles, which I'll have linked in our resources document. So toad houses are another important animal species, or another important way to cater to local ecosystems and food webs. So toads eat insects and slugs and can reduce the number of pests that might be attacking your garden. So the easiest way to build toad houses is with either an old plastic container or a terracotta pot, which are the two images that I picked here. There's other ways to do this. These two are the easiest. But to use a plastic container, you just want to cut a small entryway into it and then sink the container a few inches into the soil and then place a rock on top to add some more shade. You can also use a terracotta pot where you create a circle of rocks with leaving a little space for an entryway for the toad. And the terracotta pots are preferred because they stay a lot cooler during the summer, and toads, like I said, eat pest insects, so they're something you want to keep around because they can help your garden. So during the summer, you might also want to get your kids involved and trade your screen time for bee time. So some of these activities, like building the birdhouse or building the bird bath or bee bath, are things that you can do indoors, especially when it gets really hot. And doing these things with your kids can give you a really great opportunity to talk about the importance of these species to our world. Like pollinators obviously are so important, and that might be something you really value sharing with your kids. You can also get your kids involved in outdoor activities, like any of that early summer planting you're doing, or building a brush pile, or making your regular observations. So I also want to talk about wasps a little bit today. So hashtag Wasp Love is a campaign that I've worked on with the Bee Lab to reinforce the importance of wasps. So wasps often get this rap as being really aggressive insects, but they're actually just very territorial. Wasps are also pollinators, just like bees, butterflies, birds, and flies, but they're not necessarily as productive in terms of pollination like bees are, because they don't have as many hairs on their body. The hairs on their body is what allows these insects to be such successful pollinators. But just because wasps aren't great pollinators doesn't mean that they don't do other great things. So wasps are also omnivores. So they get some food from nectar and pollen, but they also eat smaller pest insects that might be disrupting your vegetable garden. So they're actually helping us out quite a bit. So at the end of the summer is probably when you notice a lot of wasps around. And this is because their food supply is starting to run out. Wasps will get really competitive looking for food this time of year. I mean, they're basically like hangry little insects out looking for their food. And this is why you see so many wasps out at the end of the summer, is because they're really trying to find that food and they're thinking that you are in competition for them to find food. They're on their last quest for food before they die out in the winter. But unless you have an allergy to wasp stings or you're worried about the safety of your children or your pets, you really want to let the wasps be in the summer. The entire colony will die out right after the second hard frost. So their lives are pretty short anyway, and they will really only be bothersome for a short period of time at the end of the summer. So I know I've made this point in all of our sessions so far, but making regular observations in your landscape, either through iNaturalist or in your nature journal, can help you stay connected to your landscape. Obviously, a lot of the points of building for biodiversity are to improve the quality of your landscape for local animals, but spending time in nature has so many benefits to humans as well. And doing nothing or just spending time outside and observing what's going on in your landscape can be really good for you as a human as well. And that's something that's really important. So I talked a little bit about advocacy and outreach last time as well. So maybe you want to, again, think about getting in touch with some local decision makers in your community about removing some of those invasive species that you see on your street. Or maybe you want the city to implement more native plants, or you want them to think about rewilding, or maybe think about planting bee lawns in local park areas. So staying involved in these kind of things can really help with expanding the quality of your entire community for biodiversity. So the time is finally here where we are going to talk about bee lawns in the context of fall. There are some things that you actually want to implement into your landscape in the fall, and bee lawns are one of them. But before we can get into planting your bee lawn, you might want to test your soil. So the early fall is the best time for soil testing. And soil testing can help inform you on the nutrients within your soil, how acidic your soil is, and if there are any excessive polluting nutrients that could be harming you or the health of your family or your pets or any other biodiversity. And some soils have a really high concentration of lead, and this can pose a potential risk to not only you and your family, but also to local biodiversity. So lead can actually be really toxic to bees. And if you do a soil test and you find out that your soil is really, really high in lead, your landscape might not necessarily be the most suitable area for a bee lawn. So lead and some other heavy metals are really toxic to bees, specifically honeybees. Honeybees that ingest concentrations of lead through their food are noted to have lower olfactory learning performances, and they are noted to develop smaller heads, which impacts their cognitive abilities. And the impact on their cognitive abilities can impact the functions of the colony and the key pollination services. So essentially, ingesting lead can make it hard for bees to do the things that they're supposed to do. But if you do find that your landscape is perfectly suitable for a bee lawn, you might want to go ahead and plant a bee lawn. So let's talk about everything bee lawn related here. So the first step in planting a bee lawn is choosing your site. So you want to pick an area that's not too shady. A little bit of shade is okay, but a space that's too shady can inhibit the growth of some of the flowering species that are found in a bee lawn seed mix. You might also want to think about your neighbors here. So I'm assuming that most of you attending these sessions are interested in improving your landscape to cater to biodiversity, but that might not be the case for your neighbors. Not everybody is necessarily on that same page. And some of the flowering species that are included in the bee lawn seed mix can spread quite a bit. So maybe you want to plant your bee lawn away from your neighbor's yard so there's no risk of those flowering plants spilling over into their landscape. Lower trafficked areas are also preferred for bee lawns. So this means you want to plant them in areas that you're not walking around much or that your pets aren't walking around in much. So if your dog is always in your backyard, maybe you want to plant your bee lawn in the front yard or vice versa. And another thing to remember here is that you don't have to establish your entire lawn as bee lawn all at once or even at all. Just picking a small section of your yard to create as bee lawn is totally fine. Or maybe you just want to start at that place because any expanded space for pollinators is going to be beneficial. So step 2 is thinking about when to establish. So since I'm talking about this in the context of fall planning, that's the time that I'm recommending implementing a bee lawn, but it can also be done in the spring. So planting in the fall requires a lot less maintenance because the seeds will spread and establish once it gets cold, and then they will germinate and grow in the following spring. Planting in the spring is also an option, but it requires a little bit more maintenance. The seeds will need to be regularly watered after they're planted to ensure germination, since there's no overwintering period that will allow for these seeds to spread. So step 3 here is determining how to establish. So one option is the idea of overseeding, so kind of seeding over the grass that you already have. So you might want to choose this practice if you already have a really healthy lawn that has just a few amount of weeds. So then what you want to do is mow your lawn really short, about 1 inch in length. So ideally there's a little bit of soil showing, and then you can put your seed mix into there. Or the second option is renovating your lawn entirely. So in this process, all of the existing lawn is removed and the soil should be slightly tilled to make space for the seeds. So step 4 is seeding. So the lawn can be seeded after it has been prepared using either of the methods that I just mentioned. So I have a connection that works for the Twin Cities Seed Company, and he has recommended the native bee lawn mix along with their original bee lawn mix, which I have linked in our resources document. They're available for purchase on Amazon or the Twin Cities Seed Company website. But both of these seed mixes are suitable for the Northeast area. So basically in the process of seeding, once your yard has been prepared, you want to scatter the seeds and then lightly rake them into the soil if you're planting in bare soil. And like I said, the watering component is only necessary if you are planting your seeds in the springtime. Otherwise, you don't need to water them. So as far as regular bee lawn maintenance, there's really not a whole lot of maintenance associated with having a bee lawn. If you plant in the fall, you should expect your bee lawn flowers to start blooming within the first 2 years, ideally that first spring after. But if not, then you'll probably see them the second year. And if you don't see them that second year, you might want to try again if you're still interested in having a bee lawn. But other maintenance is pretty similar to regular lawns. If you really have to, you can still mow them, but you want to avoid mowing as much as you can. And when you do mow, you want to set your mower to at least 3 inches in height. But the infrequent mowing will ultimately help your flowers bloom a little bit more consistently. And unless there's an extreme drought, your bee lawn really doesn't need to be watered much at all. I mean, the native species in there should be able to take care of themselves for the most part. So per usual, like with a normal lawn, you want to avoid fertilizers, but especially with bee lawns because they're actually pretty harmful to bee lawn flowers. They'll be more harmful than they will be helpful for those flowering species. And once you've got your bee lawn established, you want to pay attention to the pollinators that might be visiting. So I know it's called a bee lawn, but bee lawns will attract other species of pollinators like butterflies, flies, and maybe even wasps you might see in your bee lawn. So another option with planting bee lawn seed mix is to add a wildflower seed mix into the mix. So Nick has just decided to plant a bunch of bee lawn mix in his landscape and add some wildflowers into that mix. So Nick, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that process or why you decided to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been inspired by like working with Elise on this stuff, and the bee lawn stuff is interesting, but in the rewilded areas, like where I'm letting my lawn grow out in those areas, you saw the sticks and the brush piles. I thought it'd be interesting because there's no pollinator plants planted there to add wildflower mix to the rewilded areas, because those rewilded areas have been sort of cultivated as lawns for like decades. So I bought like 5 pounds of wildflower mix, and I'm just sort of like mixing it into the rewilded areas to help add pollinator food to these areas that just had grass for a long time. So yeah, so it's just like, and then there's another area where I had a grass section that I thought it would be nice to have like an accent, like a flower garden. And so I got a cheap rototiller on Home Depot for like $100. And I just like rototilled an area with my nephew that's like 5 feet by say 40 feet. We staked it off with like just some string and some, you know, like some landscape stakes. And we just planted a whole bunch of wildflowers, and then we'll see what happens. So it's going to have like a little bit more, hoping it'll have a little bit more height and a little bit more color than the bee lawn, but also be good for the pollinators. And we use the Northeast pollinator mix.
Yep, and that link is available in the resources document. We also talked a little bit about how wildflowers and the bee lawn seed mix can be really, really cost effective. I mean, planting a bee lawn seed mix is way cheaper than having sod put into your landscape. And wildflower seed mix can be a lot cheaper than buying like 5 plants that each cost $35. I mean, the bee lawn seed mix from Twin City Seed Company is 5 pounds for I think $128, and it's supposed to cover 1,000 square feet, which is huge. So it's very cost effective, and it's very beneficial to pollinators as well.
Yeah, Elise was asking like, what's the cost if you planted a sod lawn versus a bee lawn? And sod lawns are expensive. They cost, you know, $2 or $3 a square foot, and then you have to water them, and you're basically like expending all this cost and money where you could just do it for way less seeding it yourself.
Yep, so the final thing that I want to just touch on real quick in terms of planning for fall is thinking about planting new trees into your landscape, especially if you maybe removed something invasive during the winter time. So fall is the best time to establish new trees because the cooler temperatures give the trees time to establish their roots, which helps them become better prepared to handle the drought and extreme heat of the summer. So there's a lot of different trees that are good options. Doug Talany has a lot of suggestions for some trees, and then there's also a native trees and shrubs of the Northeast list. But some of the better choices for trees are the red maple, the serviceberry, black cherry, and American basswood. American basswood is my favorite tree, and honeybees are a big fan of the American basswood. But a lot of these different trees can better fit your ecosystem and serve as better food sources for local pollinators. Okay, so we will go ahead and wrap up there. I know I went through some of that stuff kind of quickly at the end, but we can take some time for questions now.
Yeah, nice job, Elise. I'm gradually experimenting with everything Elise teaches me in these sessions. I'm like going home and trying them out. So Elise, I think we could also repeat the idea of like using your house as like place to experiment, right? Using your yard as a laboratory. And
Yes.
so like every weekend I'm trying to like this weekend was removing an invasive species that I didn't realize I'd planted, right? Or like an alien ornamental, and then gradually changing it over. There's a question, Elise, on the resources. You saw that?
I just put it in the chat. Yep.
Okay. If other people have questions or want to turn the cameras on and then chime in, I've been finding it interesting, just like recognizing how many mistakes I made now that I'm learning about all this, you know, like how many mistakes I made in my yard. And it's interesting to hear Doug Tallamy talk about how he made like a lot of mistakes in his own yard, and then he's sort of trying to correct things. I don't know if how people balance that, right? You have like these beautiful old plants you might have put in, like I have all these Japanese maples that I love the look of, but now I'm like, oh, those are alien ornamentals.
Mm-hmm.
So, one question I have for you about the rabbits, are there certain heights you can put raised beds that the rabbits won't bother the plants, or will they hop up on the raised beds?
You know, that's a good question. I'm not sure exactly what the height is, but we have a really tall planter box in our backyard where we have vegetables, and we haven't had any instances of rabbits hopping up in there. But I know rabbits are really good at finding like any way to get into species that they're interested in eating, whether that's like flowering plants for pollinators or vegetables that you want to eat or whatnot. But yeah, they're good at that stuff.
Yeah, I don't know what the balance is. I think that'd be an interesting yard sculpture of like the scales of justice. Like, do you want to share the food with the rabbits, or like how do you deter the rabbits?
Yeah, right. Well, that's why we talked kind of about rewilding, is because those rewilded areas, especially if you've got wildflowers and stuff growing in there, when you have other garden beds, the rewilded areas can make much more suitable areas for the rabbits to be bothersome in.
Yeah, and one thing you call it, they like the weeds of the rewilded areas. I did notice that the rabbit loves it. They can also go and hide under all the sticks, and the hawks won't bother them. So like maybe they're not bothering my vegetables because they're out in the rewilded areas.
Right.
Well, if people don't have any questions right now, what the next session, Elise, is going to be fall practices, winter planning.
Yep. Yeah.
And you're going to graduate from school soon, so you've got a lot of homework to do to finish.
Yes. Yeah. Our next session will be after I've graduated, which is kind of exciting. All
right. Well, I think I've got 3 more pages of notes. The toad abode. One thing I will note on the toad houses, I did read you can also just use like a piece of slate or stone, and put that 2 inches off the ground. You can put it under bushes or shrubs. I've noticed the toads like that. My nephews like building toad houses.
Yeah, toads are fun.
The toad abode was a good one. I've got that on my list to try. The terracotta pots.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. Elise, I know you're got a lot of stuff to do for school, so we won't. And hope you'll join us for the next session, and have a good night.
Yeah, and as always, my email address is included in the resources document. So if anybody has any like direct questions, feel free to shoot me an email as well.